Capitol Report is a production of Senate Media Services.
On this week's program, lawmakers describe the challenges facing higher education, from budget woes to declining enrollment, and what lawmakers can do to help the institutions and the students. Plus, a look at the governor's portraits. Stay tuned for this and more on this week's Capitol Report. Welcome to this week's program. I'm Shannon Loehrke. Colleges and universities across the nation are about to begin their spring semesters. So we thought it would be a good time to talk with the chair of the Senate Higher Education Committee about the challenges facing the institutions and post-secondary students. Senator Paul Anderson now joins me in the studio. Thanks for being here.
Thanks. Glad to be back.
So as I understand it, state funding for higher education peaked prior to the Great Recession in the late 2000s. Following the Great Recession, enrollment surged, which allowed the budgets to be okay. But since then, enrollment is in decline. The funding from the state has not gone back to pre-recession levels. And so these colleges and universities are facing budget problems. Will, in your view, state contributions ever return to pre-recession levels? And if not, what does that mean for our state colleges and universities?
Well, it's a great question. I think if you look at it from a global perspective, and I actually had this chart in my office during last session, going back to the 90-91 budget here at the Capitol, higher education was 14% of the general fund budget. After last session, it's 6.5% of the budget. And if you look at that, again, globally from the statewide budget, what's really sucks the oxygen out of the room is health and human services. And so as that's grown over these last 20, 30 years, it's really pushed out things like investment in higher education. So as we've maybe not kept pace with that percentage, I still think there's significant investments in higher education in both the university system, in MnState, and also the state grant program. So we can't get lost in what's actually happened. There is significant investment.
Significant investment, but not pre-recession levels.
Correct. And I think this is an actual sign of things to come. I think when you talk about what's going on in higher education, you're seeing declining enrollment, you're seeing other factors that we need to rethink higher education. It's a system that nationally is broken. And I think as we go forward and we see these trends, this is not just Minnesota, this is nationally. And so you look at states across the nation, this is not just a Minnesota situation, this is national. And so we need to make these investments in higher education, but we also need to hold the institutions accountable, not just to say this is a marketplace decision on how they're spending money or they're asking for money from state tax dollars, but how they're spending it and how they're allocating it and how they're strategically moving forward.
Well, nationally, student debt has reached more than $1 trillion. And an educated electorate is important both for democracy and for the economy. And this student debt is weighing on our economy. So the presidential candidates at the national level, some of them are talking about a public role in eliminating student debt. Should taxpayers continue to subsidize higher education, and to what degree?
Well, again, this comes back to the debate we're going to have here this session and also going forward. We've got a massive situation coming in 2025 with a great reduction in the students that will graduate from high schools here in Minnesota and across the country. It's going to hit that declining enrollment to these institutions where they're going to have to face the reality of they're going to have to do business differently. And so in this case, yes, we need to invest in the systems, we need to invest in higher education, but we also have to have the university and MnState and our other institutions take a look at how they're going to do business differently to reduce cost. Because in the end, we can talk about retiring debt, we can talk about ways to make it more affordable, but the institutions have to figure out ways to reduce costs.
Well, and to that degree, then, the University of Minnesota Duluth has not had a balanced budget since 2011. They've announced faculty and staff cuts, the merging of some disciplines. On the other hand, the Minnesota State System of Colleges and Universities just completed a reimagining initiative, which was fascinating to read. So higher education is in the midst of a big shift. As you're saying, what do you think that looks like?
Well, and the University of Minnesota Duluth situation is indicative of what's going on again across the country. in the last 10 years, they've had a reduction in their student enrollment by about 1,000 students. That's real money when it comes to their revenue and how they allocate and how they spend money. And so I appreciate the internal discussion. I know this is real for the people of Duluth and looking at maybe even posing the conversation of us versus them. But I really think President Gabel stepped out and has committed to retiring the debt that they've been incurring and have been sitting on. This will alleviate some stress there. But in the end, this is again, in the Reimagine program that Min-State has gone through, this is how we're going to have to rethink higher education. How do you go, our 4 pillars in the Senate Higher Education Committee is affordability, accountability, accessibility, and relevancy. Those 4 pillars. And we have to have higher education look at this, understand the trends that are coming, and not just come to the taxpayers and say, you need to subsidize our situation, because if we don't make the changes, we are all in trouble. In a high-tech state, again, investments in higher education are very important. We can't expect the taxpayer payers to just subsidize the problems of higher education. It has to reinvent itself.
Well, and one issue that people point to, it was in the news recently, and some of your Republican colleagues sent a letter to the Board of Regents calling the proposed $500,000 salary of a new provost tone deaf when you consider the budget constraints and the high tuition. Should there be checks on administrative salaries?
Yeah. Well, yes, and actually last session we actually asked the university and Min-State to do a report on how they would go about reducing 10% of administrative costs. So I'm anxiously waiting, both systems coming forward with that information. But this is a situation where for higher education to simply say this is a marketplace situation, that we need to pay what the marketplace is not actually recognizing the problem that is the failures or the cracking of the higher education industry. I think we're really hitting a situation in the next 5 years where these declining enrollments, you can't just, again, subsidize it with taxpayer dollars. So there has to be some really important decisions. Now, with regards to President Gabel hiring the new provost, we also have to allow her to do her job, and this is a very important hire, and what she's told me personally is that I need this person to do the changes and make the effective change that I want to do going forward. So I take her at her word, and I trust that going forward. I think it's challenging for those. It is tone deaf to say that on a PR level, to say this is marketplace driven, because again, who is going to end this? If not now, when are we going to address the situation of out of control costs of higher education?
In recent years, there's been great emphasis and investment in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. When budgets are tight, though, the humanities tend to be the area that's cut. A recent Bloomberg opinion by Andrea Gaber suggests that tech companies are actually looking for people with liberal arts training because of their communication skills and their creative thinking ability. She goes on to say that creativity, more than skills, is an intrinsic aspect of American ingenuity and business prowess. So what is the role of humanities? How does it fit into this picture?
Well, I think it's important, but it's also important to find a new way forward. And so there's not a this or a that, it's a combination, because we do need the dreamers and the creative class to come into the conversation of how we train our workforce going forward. There's a great conversation, I've had this from high school level to college to universities, which is we need to teach more on how to learn instead of what to learn. And I think there is a piece of that creative class and arts and humanities that come into it to make sure people are thinking creatively, and the adaptation of artificial intelligence and other things coming into play, that you can't just look at what to learn, it's how to learn. So I think it's a hybrid. I mean, we desperately need the emphasis on STEM, but we also need the humanities piece of this too. I just don't know if there's a situation where we need a focus on one or the other. I think it's a hybrid approach going forward.
And one final question before we go, because you mentioned technology and artificial intelligence, which is changing our work and life landscape. There's also humanities and creative thinking. Then there's also equality. There are people with, there's educational inequity, and then there's non-traditional students, traditional students, urban, greater Minnesota. How do we, I mean, there's a lot of moving pieces.
There's a lot of moving pieces. I think everybody has to come to the table here. I mean, you just addressed it. Students coming out of high school that are looking for opportunities, that might be in the military, that might be in the workforce, that might be in higher education. You've got people that are going to be transferring skill sets that might be coming out of one industry into another. How do you train them really quickly? The aging workforce, we've got an untapped aging workforce that sometimes are prohibited from entering different positions. Employers aren't going to sit back and say, I'm going to pick and choose. They need everybody to come to the table. We also have an incredible workforce in the disability community that can contribute to the economy. So we need everybody to come to the table. We need higher education to step up and work alongside with industry, with business partnerships and employers to say, how are we going to do this? How are we going to move forward? And I'm confident in Minnesota, the state of innovation, we're going to do that.
Senator Paul Anderson, thank you so much.
Thank you.
This week, the Senate Judiciary and Public Safety Committee held a public hearing to review current laws that discourage violence.
Violence is in the news every day. And despite what's being heard outside this door, out in the foyer, this is not window dressing.
Minnesota has a mandatory minimum prison sentence. We mentioned that earlier related to crimes of violence. But certain crimes committed with a firearm would result under 609.11 in a mandatory prison sentence.
We have information about how often prosecutors objected to sentencing departures, and judges ignored these objections. And again, it's crimes of violence. That's disturbing to me.
How are we supporting our law enforcement? The people that are going out there, the people that are risking their lives to go out and protect us in this community. I think our community leaders really need to be addressing that. I think we need that support for our law enforcement, for the laws that are currently on the books. How are we enforcing those?
If the laws we as the legislature have passed are not being enforced by those who are charged with law enforcement details, part of the law and order system, how can we protect those, such as my sister and others, who are constantly in danger or have been violated through domestic abuse?
Prior to the meeting, DFL lawmakers and advocates called for an expansion of gun laws to include universal background checks and a red flag law.
We have been asking for but have received no public hearings on addressing specifically reducing gun violence. In particular, my two proposals, supported by the people behind me over many years now, to expand criminal background checks for gun purchases and to implement extreme risk protective orders. We are now having an informational hearing to remind us what existing laws look like. It seems to me this is more political window dressing than it is a serious attempt to address gun violence in Minnesota.
I believe that if we were to enact universal background checks, enact red flag laws, this type of legislation can actually make a difference in reducing gun violence in our communities, not only here in St. Paul, but across the state of Minnesota.
Limiting the scope of the hearing to the review of current laws is like checking the batteries in the smoke alarms when your house is on fire. It's a very good thing to do on a regular basis, but not the thing that will save the most lives now during a crisis.
The landscape of higher education in Minnesota is shifting due to a number of factors, including declining enrollment, technological advances, the need for workers in the trades, and the level of state support. Joining me to provide his perspective is Senator Erik Simonson. Thanks for being here.
Well, thanks for having me.
The University of Minnesota at Duluth has run structural deficits since 2011, and that has led to cuts in faculty and staff and the merging of some disciplines. Recently, University of Minnesota President Joan Gable said she'd like to get that deficit removed, but ongoing there's declining enrollment and there continue to be budgetary challenges. What needs to happen in your view?
Well, I think, first of all, I can appreciate President Gable and the work that she's done. You know, as a new incoming president, there's a lot there to understand and absorb, and appreciate the efforts that she's putting into Duluth and some of the challenges that we've had and faced over the last number of years. But Duluth the UMD is so important to Duluth and its economy. It's a critical component of our regional economy, really. And we think that it's pretty important to the university system as well. From my perspective as a legislator representing the city of Duluth, you know, I would like to see more collaboration between the system and UMD and the legislature as well. I mean, I recognize that they're, you know, an autonomous group, somewhat distanced from the legislature, but at the same time, I think they have a responsibility to the public. And I think Duluth really wants to really understand about if Duluth is being cut, you know, $5 million as an example, you know, what does that mean in the grand scheme of the whole university budget, you know? And we all know that it's a fairly small percentage of their total budget. But we're interested in trying to figure out ways to work together. And we're hopeful that with President Gable coming in that we can start off on the right foot and get things moving in the right direction, because we do need to work in maintaining and increasing UMD's enrollment. And a lot of that can be controlled through the system.
Through the entire University of Minnesota system?
Absolutely.
So Twin Cities, which I know does get more money than UMD, there's also more, so there's a conversation that you think needs to happen in terms of the university-wide.
Right, and I think the conversation for decades has been that the university is separate from the legislature and we need to keep it such. But I think that with all of the changing demographics around us and societal changes and economic changes, that the time has come that we change this conversation and we really start to understand as legislators about how these funds are being dispersed. Now, we have not had the luxury of being involved in that, and I'm not suggesting that we need to go all the way, but I am suggesting that as a community leader, someone that represents a community with a university in it, we're going to need better answers than what we've gotten historically.
Well, and one aspect of the high cost of tuition, the cost of running these institutions, is administrative salaries. And recently, some Republican lawmakers sent a letter to the Board of Regents calling the $500,000 salary of the new provost tone deaf. Is there a legislative conversation that needs to happen about administrative salaries and those costs?
It's not under the legislature's purview to control those salaries, right? And I don't necessarily draw a line between what's happening at UMD in terms of reductions versus this particular salary. I think that's up to the university system to decide what that salary should be in the Board of Regents. So I don't necessarily condone anybody for that, but I do think that conversation needs to be a bit more transparent, and I think that's what you're probably hearing from the higher education committees is that, look, with all the things going on around us, you know, perhaps a little bit more conversation on the front end could have alleviated some of the conflict that we're seeing now.
Now, UMD is a traditional university when we think of universities, but do colleges and universities like UMD need to move away from what we think of as a traditional higher education path, where there's perhaps less emphasis on degrees, more emphasis on specific skills that people will need? You know, we've got retirees, we've got non-traditional students, we have people who haven't been able to get to higher education due to socioeconomic conditions or equity gaps in their early educational experiences. We've got military people. Do changes need to, I mean, does the system need to change to reflect how society is changing and how budgets are changing?
I think any system that refuses change or doesn't accept change is going to get lost because our world is changing around us and it's changing very quickly. And the University of Minnesota is an incredibly valuable system and it has a lot of value to Minnesotans, but at the same time it does need to change or it's going to get lost. We have Minnesota State system as well, and right now that's working very well in terms of being responsive to what people are clamoring for in terms of, you know, what are the skills that you need to get a job, right? Not to say that there's not a place for higher education and those bachelor's degrees and beyond, but they're going to have to adjust or they are going to continue to lose enrollment, and that's not going to be good for anybody. So I think we as a state, especially us as a legislature, needs to take a look at our whole higher education system as a whole between Minnesota State and the University of Minnesota and figure out what does this model look like going forward? Are there ways that we can blend these together? And again, with that whole autonomous relationship with the university, that's a hard conversation to have, but we've got to figure this out.
There's growing demand for workers in the trades, which I think Minnesota State universities are going more in that direction, which isn't to say that UMD couldn't as well. Chair of the Senate Higher Education Committee, Senator Paul Anderson, has been working with businesses to partner with higher educational institutions to prepare students for these in-demand jobs. Is that a good idea?
It's a very good idea, and I think you've seen Minnesota State go down that path for a while. You know, they see that as that's their bread and butter. Being responsive to what the needs of Minnesotans are. But I would concur with him that I think that is absolutely the direction the university needs to go. We can't stay in the same model that we've always had for the last 100 years and expect it to work for the next 100 years. We've got to be able to adapt, and the only way that you can do that is to be able to respond to some of those changes a little bit more quickly.
Senator Erik Simonson, thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me. It's been great.
The Minnesota State Capitol is the seat of state government, housed in an historic and beautiful building. It is also a history in portraiture, housing the collection of gubernatorial portraits spanning more than 150 years. The official state portrait of Mark Dayton, the 40th governor of Minnesota, was recently unveiled in a ceremony held in the Rotunda. It hangs in the west wing of the Capitol on the ground floor in a corridor with Governor Tim Pawlenty, Governor Jesse Ventura, and around the corner, Governor Arne Carlson. These are all portraits, though, paintings, not photographs. Why is that?
Well, the importance of oil on canvas is the permanence, because if you had a photograph, that's going to fade over time. And so the goal of the Minnesota Historical Society and the Capital Area Architectural Planning Board is to have a piece of art that's going to be there for decades and generations to come. So you want something that's a traditional oil painting on a canvas.
These paintings differ remarkably over the years. Alexander Ramsey, Henry Sibley, those are small paintings. Some, like Governor Arne Carlson, are quite large. What explains the differences in the size and how these paintings are the decisions that are made?
Yeah, that's a really interesting story to tell about the portraits, because what you are looking at is you're looking at portraits from the 1850s all the way up to the present day. And so you get a really good story about art history and how portraits were done. So you have very traditional, very formal paintings from the 1850s to the 1890s, early 1900s, the traditional governor with the hand in the coat, you know, that type of thing. And then you start in the 1930s having a little bit more personalization of the governor. So Floyd B. Olson was the first kind of a little bit more less formal painting. He's portrayed standing in front of the Capitol. The Capitol's behind him, and he's holding a microphone for the radio. And he was one of the first governors to really use that technology to have these statewide conversations over the radio. So that was kind of a nice little kind of a part of his administration as a governor, and a part of his personality, very charismatic, very outgoing.
I noticed in Governor Arne Carlson's portrait there are two butterflies, a blue and a yellow bird. Also in Governor Jesse Ventura's, there's Rodin's The Thinker, and there's a train in the background. What do these symbols indicate?
Well, it really typifies some of their achievements as a governor. The process for the last several decades is the governor, when they finish their term of office, gets to select their portrait artist and also what they want to be portrayed as, or how they want to be remembered in that portrait. So they work with the artist to work out some of those details. And so once again, if you look at some of the more recent portraits from in the last 30, 40 years, you do have characteristics or things that identify that person's interest. So we can go back to Al Quie, has horses in the background. Well, he's an avid horse rider, and has been his whole entire life. So those are his horses that are being portrayed in that painting. And you have Arne Carlson as the butterflies. One is a butterfly you'd find in Sweden. One is a butterfly you find in Minnesota, because he has Swedish roots. He's Swedish-American descent. So it makes the things very personalized for these governors to have those stories told in the portraits.
As you view all these governors' portraits, some are seated at or near a desk, some have books or flags. Governor Tim Pawlenty and Governor Mark Dayton, as is Governor Floyd Bjelsen, outside. How are the settings chosen?
Well, that's kind of a conversation between the artist and the governor. So they can pick and choose what they want as their setting. And for instance, with Pawlenty, it typifies this was the center of government. This is where he worked. This is where all of his achievements were made, was in that capital. With Governor Dayton, it's really acknowledging the importance of the state capitol, but he was also the leading official that led the preservation, restoration, repair of the capitol. So that's a part of his legacy. That's something that you want to be remembered. Not only did you serve here, but it's a place that you help preserve for future generations.
One portrait is distinctly different from the others, and that's the one of Governor Rudy Perpich, because it includes his wife Lola. What's the story behind that?
Well, the tradition for any governor portrait is to have just the governor as the person in that portrait. Governor Perpich had served non-consecutive terms, so he did have his first official portrait on display here, but because he had served a second term, he wanted to have that first portrait and a new portrait on display in the Capitol. And the Capitol area Architectural Planning Board said, well, you can only have one representation. And he wanted to have his painting with his wife, Lola. And so that brought up this whole controversy about it should be just the governor. And so he was asked not to have her in that painting. And so he had a campaign, basically put billboards on University Avenue, saying that they're not letting me and my wife in the building. So, it just became kind of a sticky issue for several years. And then after he passed away, the family and other supporters got money to do a portrait with Lola in that painting. So you'll see Lola and Rudy in the same painting today.
Each one of these portraits has a plaque next to it explaining the accomplishments of that governor's administration. Who writes those?
That's overseen by the Minnesota Historical Society. So we contract with historians or other people to write those biographical plaques and the information.
Is the content ever controversial?
That's the problem if you have portraits of living people or being portrayed. Sometimes it's hard to really tell their story because they're still living that story. So sometimes that can be a controversial issue. With the older governors, you have a little bit of time to really see what the permanence of that legislation they might have been supporting, the effect that has. So you have a better idea of the impact that governor did have 100 years ago.
In a sense, these portraits tell the history of the state through time. What do visitors, do they comment ever about these portraits?
There's a lot of people who will, as they're walking through the building, are curious. They want to see who these people are. They know some, they recognize some from their lifetime, and so they're interested in reading about them and seeing them portrayed here. And people usually comment, it's nice to see these portraits here because it does reflect that history of Minnesota and the different people that has served as that executive officer.
Join us again next week as we delve into more topics affecting Minnesotans. I'm Shannon Loehrke, and on behalf of all of us at Senate Media Services, thanks for watching.